The American West, the last great frontier. With the soaring mountain ranges, raging rivers, expansive prairies, and brutally unforgiving winters, the West was a place of highs and lows. Certainly not a no man's land, with upward of 80 million Native Americans spreading across the country at one point. The United States thought the land barren and wished to connect the country from east to west. Laid out as early as the late 1700s, maps showed overland routes for fur trade. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 solidified ownership of the West to the United States. Later, the Homestead Act of 1862 enticed Americans westward. Also in 1862, the Pacific Railway Act was passed. From the steps of the U.S. Capitol to the Great Rocky Mountains was nearly 2,000 miles, and transportation was limited to wagon, foot, and waterway travel. For the West to expand, transportation infrastructure needed to grow. Railroads seemed the obvious answer. The black steaming beast shook not only thousands of miles of ground, but also the economy, Indian-American relations, and how Americans would ultimately navigate their way into the 20th century. The brutal geography of the West was enough to make some railroaders turn back. Weather, skirmishes, racial tensions, and grueling, sometimes deadly work pushed others away. For the founders of the Transcontinental Railroad, however, there was no challenge they were not prepared to conquer. The race to the West was set. In the 1850s, the eastern seaboard of the United States was utilizing trains to connect passengers as well as freight. Building a railroad across arguably the most difficult terrain in the country was not going to come easy. According to historian and author D. Brown, by 1865, Union Pacific had built their headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska. There was no railway built to Omaha yet, and transport of railroad materials came via steamboat to the Omaha landing site. The financial undertaking was not light. Banks believed the scope of the project was too ambitious and the risk of lending too high, while no single company had enough reserves to privately fund the venture without assistance. The United States federal government, however, was eager to get more use out of Western lands. As people settled and commerce commenced across this portion of the country, the American economy would boom, many assumed. And since the country was still recovering financially from the Civil War, this was an opportunity to restabilize. As an enticement for the railroad construction, the land-rich federal government was able to create land grants. In fact, 4 of the 5 major railroads were built on land grant areas. The next big obstacle was the labor force. Technology of the time meant spikes were driven by hammer and ties laid by hand. Armies of laborers, often foreign, built the railroad manually. Met with resistance from tribal members and local landowners, railroad workers made their way across the country. Many members of the crew were killed, scalped, or maimed along the way. Despite the adversity, the railroad met completion at Promontory Point on May 10, 1869, when Leland Stanford joined the rails of the first Transcontinental Railroad with the legendary Golden Spike. After all the work, money, and lives lost, why was the railroad so important to the West? In 1818, Henry Fearon noted that, quote, "The American has always something better in his eye, further west. He therefore lives and dies on hope, a mere gypsy in this particular." The allure of the American dream was deeply rooted in the West. The solitude of the West, however, was burdensome to those that settled in the area. Transportation brought stability to a region that often teetered on the edge of personal collapse. As supplies and ideas permeated the West, the area boomed.